All right, and hello everyone. My name is Jungle Book One. I am a North American competitive player in Teamfight Tactics, and Set 15 PBE is right around the corner. And before then, I would like to share some of my knowledge with all of you. On stream, I've been coaching viewers recently, and I've noticed this was a kind of mistake or misconception, if you will, that many of my students had. So I wanted to cover this topic in this video. So as the title implies, we're going to be discussing when to level on 4-1 versus 4-2 in the context of level 8 comps. So let's get right into it. So there are many key factors to consider when making this decision, and I narrowed it down to 3. So number 1 is how much gold do you have? Pretty self-explanatory. Number 2 is how much health do you have? And number 3 is how many contesters are there in the lobby? And another note is considering how rich the contesters are relative to you. So first, I want to talk about the conditions, pros, and cons of a 4-1 roll down. So the first condition is going to be gold, and you'll notice that these conditions are the key factors to consider that we mentioned in this first slide. So the first condition will be an abundance of gold. So honestly, you're probably looking for around, I noted, 50 to 60 plus after leveling to 8. Obviously, in certain situations, you might level with 45 gold or 40 gold, depending on how dire the situation is. But in general, this is the number that you're looking for to expect to hit at least 1-star copies of your forecast, if not hopefully high rolling slightly and hitting a 2-star copy. It has a pretty okay chance of happening. The second factor to consider is if you are lacking in the HP department. So we're talking about 2 lives or less, so probably around the 20-21 HP mark starting stage 4. Obviously you could drop that down to whatever, because you could be lower. It does happen depending on how many losses and the gravity of the losses you took in stages 2 and 3. And the third factor is if you are very contested. The third condition, is if you are very contested, oftentimes you will want to roll on 4-1 when your contesters are unable to, if they're too poor, and they're forced to roll on 4-2 so that you can grab the units before them. Examples of when you might be able to, or when you're often going to be able to roll on 4-1 is if you take an econ augment. These are things like calculated loss, level up, upward mobility, which give you an advantage in gold. Another example is when you're playing from either a loss or a win streak, because obviously streaks in TFT accrue you a larger amount of interest per round. And the final consideration, but not limited to these 3, just as an example, are econ portals such as Scuttle Puddle or Crab Rave or Gold Subscription or even Loot Subscription, which could all give you an abundance of gold. And then also neutral rounds, which can often give you gold orbs or prismatic orbs containing a large influx of gold, which will allow you to roll on 4-1. The pros of rolling on 4-1, as I kind of dabbled in earlier, are you get to roll before the contesters, which is probably the biggest factor. Being able to grab the units, like let's say you're 2, even 3-way contested sometimes. Being able to roll before other people and grabbing the units that you need, especially the forecasts, which there are only a limited number in the pool, is super crucial. So if you're able to 4-1, that is basically the main advantage. Another advantage, however, which is also very relevant, is maximizing the chance of winning 4-1 and potentially 5 streaking stage 4. And this is very, very important if you are playing from loss streak, which I was mentioning earlier. Like, for example, if you're playing from calculated loss econ and then you're playing Cypher, and let's say you went on a 10 loss streak and you're at 1 or 2 lives, then winning from 4-1 onward is extremely, extremely crucial. And dropping the life on 4-1 is often game losing on the spot. And number 3 is kind of more minor, but a pro nonetheless that I thought of. Is you do tax the 4-1 opponent that you fight, because very often going 4-1 is very difficult, and if you're able to do a full roll down on 4-1 with an upgraded level 8 board, you'll very often 7-0, maybe even 8-0, 6-0, 8-0, whichever opponent you're fighting, and put a lot of pressure on the lobby in general. And essentially the biggest con and the biggest thing preventing you from 4-1ing is your economy, right? So this is a very big hit to your economy when you are leveling up for 1, because you level one round, you lose one round of interest and level off interval, essentially meaning you have to spend 4 more gold to get to level 8. So if you're too poor and you're not careful with this decision, there's a high chance you miss and lose the game on the spot. However, if you are playing from a 10 loss and you are 1 or 2 lives, obviously there will be situations where you're just forced to level on this turn and you just pray you hit, even if you don't have the abundance of gold that we're talking about, which can happen. So that is pretty much everything about 4-1 rolldowns. So now we're going to talk about 4-2 and compare. So the conditions of a 4-2 rolldown are closely to opposite of 4-1. So the first condition is you're looking at your gold, and you'll notice that this is the first thing I'm mentioning, and very often this is the most important factor. How rich are you? And so there will be games very often where you aren't having the 50 to 60 plus gold that I mentioned in the previous slide, in which case you might want to consider delaying your level until 4-2. Another condition is you have an abundance of HP and you can afford to sacrifice the 1 round on 4-1. And you can afford to take that loss, because very often you're going to be sitting on a lot of gold. And like I said, if you run into somebody who did roll a lot of gold on 4-1, or if they just happen to have a strong natural board, a natural tempo board, if you have a lot of HP, like let's say, 50 plus, I mean, you can even do it with like 40 sometimes, but even and then even more so if you're 80, 90, 100, very often you can afford to sack this 1 round in order to make sure that you can hit your board the next turn, make sure you have enough gold to do so, and that way that will imply that you're able to win more rounds later on in the game. So it's kind of like an investment where you're investing HP for board strength later on. Examples of when you might have this type of gold profile, it's honestly pretty common, but maybe you weren't able to pick up econ augments. Perhaps you were mixed streaking, which means you weren't really getting a lot of big streak win or lose streaks, so you weren't getting a lot of income that way. Also, it can just happen where there's like a low econ portal, and honestly, now that I think about it, it's not necessarily like low as in there's no portals that like take gold away from you, but portals that are low resources. So for example, like Golden Gala, or even something like the component anvils, which does give you items in terms of resources, but it doesn't give you gold, right? And then also low econ neutrals is a common thing. The gold drop on each given neutral could be just relatively low for the game. You could get dropped no gold, no prismatic orbs, just making it a very flat and low gold game. And then a final example that I noted was when you were playing like from very high tempo. And what I mean by this is if you're aggressively leveling up to, let's say, like level 4, level 5, level 6, level 7, that can take a tax on your econ, especially if you're not full streaking. But you could still come out with like, let's say like 80, 90 HP, but you might be on the poorer end, in which case that does meet the conditions of 1 and 2 where you're lacking gold and you have an abundance of HP. Also I just realized I forgot to even mention the third condition, which is if you're uncontested or one-way contested on your comp, very often you can get away with holding off for 1 turn. The pros of 4-2ing, as we kind of talked about already, the biggest one is that you're preserving your economy. So as we mentioned, for 4-1ing, you're going to have to lose a round of interest and spend an extra 4 gold to level to 8 on 4-1. Whereas if you wait till 4-2, you get to save that interest and you get to level on interval, so you essentially save 4 gold leveling to 8. If you're uncontested, it allows the other level 8 players as well to thin the 4 cost pool out for you. So for example, if you're rolling for the Exotech Zeri board and you're uncontested, everybody else who rolls on 4-1, let's say they take a lot of Annies and Nikos and Leonas and Ophelios and Zayas and Zeds, right? All the other 4 cost units, that will increase your chances of hitting Sejuani and Zeri when you do roll on 4-2. And obviously this only applies if you're uncontested or like at most like one-way contested. And the third pro of rolling on 4-2 is actually you get more time for your roll down. Note that I said or less, because the augment rounds, which happen to fall on 4-2, have more time in the round, assuming you can pick your augment relatively quickly. So very often, if you are able to pick your augment quickly, you will have more time to execute your roll down. which is certainly a valid pro. And the cons of 4-2ing, again, we've covered a lot of it already, is if you are contested, it is harder to hit the units that you need. So obviously in the situation where I was talking about Zeri earlier, that changes if you have one or two other people playing Zeri, because they will be taking Zeris and Sejuani's out of the pool, thus decreasing your chances of hitting. And then the second con is that you potentially sacrifice HP on 4-1. And I say potentially because you could, there is a chance you could run into somebody else who's planning on 4-2ing, and your natural board could just happen to be stronger, in which case that's great. You just get to win 4-1 for free. But the other possibility is that you fight somebody who was lost streaking the whole game, and then they send all their gold on 4-1, and then they do a lot of damage to you. So that is technically the other con, which is why the abundance of HP is often very important when you are considering rolling on 4-2. So that essentially covers the conditions, pros, and cons of 4-1 and 4-2. So hopefully that gives you a better idea of all the things to consider. And honestly, I didn't have a perfect grasp on this myself. And I've been challenger for a couple sets, and I didn't have a perfect grasp of this until probably this set, like just how much gold you need, because it really was more gold than I thought that you need to feasibly hit at least 1-star copies, and like hopefully upgrading your 2 and 3 costs and sometimes your 1 costs. And then so with this final slide, I want to give you some general tips for executing rolldowns, and how challenger players are able to perform at the highest level and what you might be lacking. So the number one thing, the first thing is I would highly recommend utilizing the team planner. It's, in my eyes, it's a free resource and it really speeds up my rolldowns personally. So if you don't know what the team planner is, it's just this little button in the upper right that you can press, and it essentially lets you plan out your team. So you select each of the units that you need. So let's say you're playing 7 Exotech, you can select Mordekaiser, Jax, Nefiri, Jhin, Zeri, etc. And these units will glow up in your shop when they appear. So it's a lot, for me, it's a lot easier to see and buy them quickly. And it really does speed up my rolldowns personally. So I'd highly recommend using it, or at least trying it. Number 2 is do not spend time buying useless units if committed to a comp. So if you're somebody like me, I've always had this bad habit of buying 4 and 5 costs that I just know I'm never going to use. So an example of this is, again, Zeri. Zeri you could technically like flex with Vanguard with the items. So I'll say Amp. Amp is a great example of this, because when you're playing Annie and you have very specific items for Annie or Yumi, you know you're never going to play something like a Zeri 2 or a Xayah 2 or an Aphelios 2 on your board, just to name a few examples. Or even some of the 5 costs, right? Like even like Aurora can be very difficult to play in those types of situations. Urgot, you know, the list kind of goes on based on the comp. But essentially, I found myself wasting a lot of time buying these units just out of habit. And it really did slow me down a lot. It just fills up your bench and it clutters your board and bench a lot. So I would highly recommend trying not to do that, because even though you are technically increasing your odds by thinning the 4 and 5 cost pools, the difference is so negligible that the time you save from not buying them is more valuable. That's what I found. So I would highly recommend trying to break that habit if it does apply to you. And number 3, we kind of mentioned this earlier, but this is super, super crucial, and it's a mistake I see very often from even players as high as Master or Grandmaster, or even Challenger. Sometimes it happens to me. You need to pick your 4-2 augment if you are rolling a 4-2 as fast as possible. And the reason for that is, as I mentioned earlier, the augment rounds give more time than any other round. So on 4-2, you have more total time than 4-1, and that's because it's accounting for the augment selection. However, if you're able to select your augment very, very quickly, then you will have more time to roll than you will on any other turn. And TFT is a game of time pressure, so every second is so valuable. So I'd highly recommend, don't agonize over augment selections that are like super close to each other, because honestly, if the choice is that close, very often it'll be a negligible difference. And again, the more important thing is that you're giving yourself as much time as possible to roll. So just take an augment that obviously think about it, but just take one that you think looks best, trust your gut on that, and then I would just recommend going quickly. Um, and so kind of to go off of that, I wrote that performing actions with urgency and intention, especially when contested, is super, super crucial. And that's because speed is very important. And as I said, every second counts so that you can hit before your contesters. And so every single second that you save could be another role where a Zeri shows up in your shop or a Sejuani shows up in your shop. And if you're able to get those units to show up before your contesters, that's super, super crucial and will increase your odds. And also, not to mention that losses in stage 4 and onward cost a ton of HP. So being able to execute and do as much of your roll down as possible is super, super crucial so that you can be as strong as possible every round and win every possible round. And then, so that being said, I did make a final note, which does apply to me as well, which is don't get too careless and kind of, I've heard people say, be a little humble, in the sense that not everybody is going to have the same rolling speed as others. For example, I'm not as fast as some of the fastest players in Challenger. However, I'm able to find a speed that's good enough for me and works for me. And I have honed that and I've been working on that for multiple sets now. So start off with what makes you comfortable and then slowly find ways that you can optimize it and speed it up over time. And over time, if you are practicing this intentionally with urgency, I promise you that it will slowly improve. And with the set 15 PBE coming around, that's honestly a great opportunity for you to practice these types of things. I'm trying to think. I do think there's one more thing that I missed that I forgot to write down, but this is kind of a more specific scenario. But if you're playing, I want to give you an example. If you're playing something like 7 Exotech, and you have the option of making a Varus 2, let's say early on to roll down 40-30 gold, but you still don't have Zeri or Sejuani, you definitely want to skip that Varus 2, especially if it doesn't have items, which the reason I picked Varus is because it very often does not have items in that comp. You're often itemizing the other units first. You very often skip the Varus because making that Varus 2 is not as valuable as finding a single copy of both Zeri and Sejuani. And if you're missing any of the other exotechs, obviously, like let's say you're missing Nefiri or Jhin, right? Finding the first copy of those 7 is so crucial that it very often is worth it to just skip the Varus 2 so that you can maximize your chances of hitting the 4 cost first. And then once you hit the 4 cost, that's when you can consider making and investing that 9 gold into the Varus 2. And this applies to pretty much any comp. It can apply to like Street Demon, for example, like making like Rengar or Jinx 2 before you have Nico or Brand, right? That's just another example. So I would highly recommend looking out for that. And again, be hesitant on making those less important units before you have the single copy of the really crucial ones. So that will pretty much be it. Thank you guys so much for watching. I am going to be streaming every day of PBE starting on July 16th. So I am really looking forward to that. Set 15 is definitely going to be a good time. I'm going to leave all my social links in the description, but the most important one is the Twitch. So make sure to please give me a follow if you enjoyed. And please leave a comment as well if there's anything that you'd like me to cover. I mean, I have some ideas in mind myself, but I would certainly be open to considering feedback if anybody has any good suggestions. But yeah, otherwise, thank you guys very much for watching, and I will catch you guys next time. Peace.